Roy Callahan's obituary ran in the Knoxville Gazette on a Thursday morning in November. It was a quiet tribute, 4 paragraphs, a photograph from 1987, the kind of notice a good man receives when he has lived a decent life without much noise. Margaret wrote it herself, at the kitchen table, in the farmhouse they had shared for 38 years. She wrote about his garden, she wrote about his laugh, and near the end, in the section that listed who he left behind, she wrote this, survived by his beloved wife Margaret, his children Diane and Kevin, and his dear friend Brenda, who made his final years brighter. Margaret meant every word. What she did not know, as she typed that sentence, was that by the time that obituary reached print, Brenda had already moved $31,000 out of accounts Margaret did not fully understand she had signed for. She had written her husband's thief into his memorial. And she had done it with love. This is not a story about a con artist who appeared from nowhere. It is not a story about a stranger who spotted a vulnerable woman and moved fast. This is a story about patience. About the kind of long, deliberate, quiet patience that most people never consider possible, because most people cannot imagine spending 9 years building toward a single moment of theft. Brenda did not rush. She had chosen Margaret and Roy Callahan carefully, and she had made herself so necessary to their lives that by the time Roy was gone and Margaret was alone and the grief had made everything soft and uncertain, there was never a question of who would step forward. Brenda was already there. She had always been there. That was the plan. Roy and Margaret Callahan had lived on the same 12 acres outside Knoxville for the better part of 4 decades. The farmhouse was not large, but it was theirs. Every fixed floorboard, every repainted window frame, every argument about the kitchen tile a layer in the walls. Roy kept a vegetable garden that occupied the southeast corner of the property and a significant portion of his identity. Margaret drove the long road into town for groceries, attended the same church they had attended since their 30s, and called her daughter Diane every Sunday evening without variation. It was a life that asked very little of the world and received very little in return. And it was exactly the kind of life Brenda had been looking for. Roy's heart condition arrived in his early 70s. He and Margaret adapted. Life contracted without breaking. It was during this period, approximately 6 years before his death, that Brenda appeared in their congregation, warm, capable, reliably present. She remembered Roy's name from their second meeting. She asked about his health with the specific, interested attention of someone who genuinely cared. She brought food when people in the church were sick and stayed to wash the dishes afterward. Diane would later say there had been one moment when something had felt slightly wrong. Brenda had offered to drive Roy to a medical appointment Margaret couldn't make. Diane had felt, briefly, something she couldn't name. She told herself she was being uncharitable. She filed the feeling away and forgot it. That feeling would not return for 6 more years. Diane drove 4 hours on a Wednesday and did not tell anyone she was coming. She arrived at the farmhouse at 9 in the evening. Brenda's car was in the driveway. Inside, Margaret was on the living room couch, quieter than Diane had ever seen her, sitting slightly apart from herself in the way that grief sometimes leaves people. Brenda was at the kitchen table with Margaret's laptop open in front of her. She smiled when Diane walked in. It was a practiced smile. Diane smiled back. She stayed the night. The next morning, while Brenda was outside, Diane sat with her mother at the kitchen table. Margaret was confused about small things, what day it was, whether she had eaten breakfast. She mentioned, without particular concern, that Brenda had been helping with the finances since Roy died. When Diane asked how, specifically, Margaret could not recall the details. She said Brenda had explained everything and that it all made sense at the time. That night, Diane sat in her car in the dark driveway with the engine running and called Kevin. They agreed to move quietly and fast. Kevin requested the property records first. One of the outbuildings Roy had built himself, a timber frame structure in the northeast corner of the property that had taken him 3 summers to complete, had been transferred out of Margaret's name. The registered owner was a company Kevin had never heard of. The company's registered agent was Brenda's daughter. The bank statements arrived 9 days later, and when they did, Diane sat down on the kitchen floor and did not get up for a while. $94,000. Moved an amount small enough to avoid automatic flags, never more than $8,000 at a time. Labeled, in the memo fields, as home repairs, medical expenses, groceries. One transfer, for $6,000, had been labeled simply, gift, with love. It was that last one Diane kept returning to. Gift, with love. Typed into a transfer field by someone who had calculated, with great precision, how much love was worth. There was a notarized document, Margaret added as a cosigner to an account, then quietly removed 6 months later once the transfers were complete. The notary, when contacted, remembered her as confused. She had arrived alone. Brenda had driven her and waited in the car outside. It was Kevin who found the email. He was searching Margaret's inbox, going methodically through years of correspondence, when he entered Brenda's name into the search field. The earliest result was not from 6 years ago. It was from 9 years ago, a message in which Brenda introduced herself as a volunteer with a senior community outreach program and expressed interest in connecting with Roy and Margaret. Kevin spent 40 minutes searching for any record of that program. It did not exist. It had never existed. She had not wandered into their lives. She had chosen them, 9 years earlier, when Roy was still healthy and Margaret was still whole, and she had spent nearly a decade making herself indispensable to a family she had already decided to rob. She had simply been waiting for the right moment of vulnerability. Roy's death had been that moment. She had been ready for it before Roy was even sick. They sat with Margaret at the kitchen table and showed her the documents one at a time. Margaret listened. She nodded. Then she argued. She told them Brenda would not do this. She told them there had to be an explanation, that they had misread something, that Brenda had been there when no one else was. She defended her for 20 minutes, her voice rising, her hands trembling slightly on the edge of the table, and Diane let her, because taking that away too quickly would have been its own kind of cruelty. Then Margaret picked up the document showing the transfer of Roy's outbuilding. She looked at it for a long time. She set it down. She did not say anything else. Something in her face did broke. And that silence was worse than anything she could have said out loud. Adult Protective Services. A police report filed on a Friday afternoon in a county sheriff's office that smelled of old coffee and carpet cleaner. A civil attorney named Patterson who told Diane, carefully and without drama, that cases of this nature were more difficult to prosecute than they should be, because Margaret had signed documents. And several of the transfers carried her consent, extracted from a mind that was grieving and increasingly uncertain, but consent nonetheless. The law, Kevin learned in those weeks, was not designed to protect people who had trusted too much. It was designed to protect signatures. Brenda, when contacted by law enforcement, produced documentation of her own, text messages, selectively preserved and edited just enough to suggest that Margaret had been grateful, willing, enthusiastic. She retained a lawyer within 48 hours of first contact. She had been prepared for this moment too. That detail, perhaps more than any other, clarified exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. Margaret stayed with Diane while the legal process began. The farmhouse sat empty. Roy's vegetable garden, the one he had tended with the focused devotion of a man who needed to watch things grow, was unrecognizable within 2 months. The hardest conversation was not with the lawyer or the detective or the county social worker. It was the second conversation with Margaret, 3 weeks after the first, when she had had time to sit with the full shape of what had happened. She looked at Diane across the kitchen table and asked, very quietly, "Did she ever actually like me?" Diane did not answer immediately. She took her mother's hand. She said, "She chose you." Whatever that means. It was not enough. But it was true. And in that moment, truth was the only currency Diane had left to offer. The civil case ran for nearly 2 years. They recovered $38,000, roughly a third of what had been taken. The criminal proceedings resulted in a plea agreement, supervised probation, restitution payments that would arrive in small installments over 5 years, no prison time. Diane sat in the courtroom on the day of sentencing and watched Brenda walk out through a set of glass doors into an ordinary afternoon, and she understood something she had not understood before, that justice and closure are not the same thing, and that a person can spend years reaching for one and never once touch the other. She drove home in silence. She did not cry until she was on the long rural road to the farmhouse, and then she cried for a long time. Margaret moved back to the farmhouse in the spring. Kevin drove up on a Saturday and built a raised garden bed in the southeast corner, lower than Roy's original one but easier on her knees, and she planted tomatoes before the soil was probably ready, because she had been waiting all winter to plant something. She began calling Diane every Sunday again. She joined a different church, one where nobody had known Brenda, and she sat in the third pew and sang the hymns she had always known. Several months later, she contacted the county sheriff's office and asked whether they ran any kind of elder fraud awareness program. They did. She began speaking at their sessions to rooms of people her age. She told Diane she did not do it to punish Brenda. She did it because for a long time she had felt ashamed, and she wanted other people to understand that the shame belonged to the person who had planned it, not the person who had trusted. 18 months after the plea agreement, Diane drove out to the farmhouse for a long weekend. On Saturday morning she came downstairs to find Margaret already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her phone in her hand, looking at the screen. Margaret looked up and asked, quietly and without thinking, "Has Brenda called?" The words were out before she could stop them. She caught herself. She looked at Diane. She knew exactly what she had said and precisely what it meant. Diane said no. Margaret nodded once. She turned to the counter and filled the kettle. Neither of them mentioned it again. They had breakfast. The tomatoes were coming in well. Outside the kitchen window, on the southeast corner of the property Roy had spent a lifetime tending, something green and ordinary was growing in the ground. Some wounds close while some just learned to stay quiet. Have you ever defended someone who was hurting you, because you couldn't afford to believe what you were seeing? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you in the next story.